Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras at Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. On today's Fronteras, we take a look at the issue of immigration. Christian G.A. Zeller is a managing partner at Maney, Gordon & Zeller, PA, and limits his practice to immigration and nationality law. He is our guest today to discuss the complicated issue of immigration. Christian, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you.
It seemed that I had you about a little bit under a year ago.
I think it was last January, yes.
It was last January, and when we got together, there was optimism that there was possibility that DACA would be fixed, that immigration would at least be considered. Where are we?
Well, immigration has not been considered, and we're still optimistic. With DACA, DACA is still alive and well.
Is it alive and well, or is it barely breathing?
It is alive, let's say it's on a lifeline. DACA is still out there, and what it is, by way of history, if you recall, the president wanted to phase out DACA late in 2017 and gave all DACA recipients a chance who had DACA to renew their DACA for one more time. Well, as soon as that happened, of course, the lawsuits started popping up, first in the Ninth Circuit out in California, and then later on in Washington, D.C., and also in New York. And that resulted in injunctions, meaning that DACA remains, but only for DACA persons who already applied for it previously, they can continue to extend it. But persons who want a fresh DACA, they can't get it. So if you haven't had DACA before, unfortunately, you cannot apply.
How many DACA recipients are there currently in the United States?
There should be around 800,000.
800,000. Mm-hmm. And these are people that are literally living in limbo, not knowing what direction it's going. Where is it in terms of the courts?
In terms of the courts, the latest that we've heard is that in the Southern District of Texas, a new lawsuit starts to be brewing because Texas seems to think that we are not phasing out DACA, we ought to get rid of it right away. And it seems to that this case is going to work its way up the chain, and hopefully it's going to make it to the Supreme Court, and that's where we will get a decision, hopefully sooner than later.
How do you feel the Supreme Court, which way do you think it'd go? We're looking at a Supreme Court that is majority conservative.
That's correct, but if you go back in history, Edmundo, you know, if you look at the past immigration legislation, if you look at the amnesties in the past, all that happened under conservative administration. So I am optimistic, and I'm going to remain optimistic that this is going to work out for all the DACA recipients.
Okay, we're going to talk about this a year from now and see where we're at. But right now, let's talk about, because there's a lot of things that are up in the air. Let's talk about the history of immigration to better have a conversation to find out how we got to where we're at.
Right.
Okay, what would you feel is the earliest significant immigration law that was passed?
Well, the earliest significant laws that was in the late 1800s, really, during the Civil War. Before that, there was complete unimpeded immigration. Anyone would come in. But then, during the Civil War, there was an encouragement for immigration because the nation needed workers in its factories. So that made a lot of sense. But also the first restrictions came in. So there were exclusions for prostitutes, there were exclusions for convicts, persons who had committed crimes involving moral turpitude. There were exclusions for unaccompanied minors. Does that sound familiar? Right? 200 years later.
Civil War. Okay.
Right. 200 years later, we are still dealing with that same issue. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that we got some solid immigration laws, and that really was in 1952 when the Immigration and Nationality Act was established, which is the law that we still use today.
What was established in 1952?
The most significant things I think that were established at the time is that we got these preference quotas. So if you were to petition for a brother or a sister, there is now a quota. In the past, there used to be a quota. Or if an employer was going to bring in a worker, now there is a quota on how many workers can be brought in every year. So that was a very significant thing that happened in 1952. A lot of the other things or other exclusions, for example, the Asians weren't allowed in the United States in the past, so that was all done away, so no more discrimination on that. And that was about the main thing that happened in 1952, and we're still using that law.
Okay, let's talk about pre-1952. What was the reason for passing a new immigration law in 1952?
The reason was that that deportation in and of itself did really not exist prior to 1952. What existed prior to 1952 was exclusion, meaning we're not going to let you in. But with the Immigration and Nationality Act, all of a sudden we got deportation, so people could actually be removed from the country. So we got deportation and relief from deportation.
Interesting. So in 1952, this was all established. How has it evolved since 1952?
The next big legislation that came was in 1986. And
so we went from 1952 through 1986 without any major changes?
Not quite. There were always some changes, little acts, little changes, but nothing really of significance. The biggest change really came in 1986, and what most of us remember is, of course, the 1986 amnesty.
And they called it amnesty.
They called it.
And it was not a bad word.
It was not a bad word then, no. It was called an amnesty, and of course there were different categories. Anyone who had been here as of a certain date, or there were a certain relief was available for Cubans and for Haitians. So there were many different aspects to that amnesty, and it was really, I believe, up to 3 million people who garnered entry at that time, or who garnered temporary and later permanent residence in the United States. That was the one side that the 1986 Act did, and the other side was the proposed enforcement. The Congress, of course, said, okay, if we're going to let all these folks in, we got to do something on the other side with the enforcement. And so they established the I-9 system, where employers had to check whether a person was authorized to work legally in the United States. So those were that was the give and take under that law.
I remember the 1986 law very specifically because I was a teenager and I was growing up in Houston, and we had family members and friends that were undocumented. And they went through the process, and it was not a simple process. It was a very long and complicated process where they had to prove that they had been here, they had to go through immigration background checks. When there are proposals currently, when there's discussion, it's such taboo because the assumption is that everybody can just become residents.
Well, in 1986, what folks had to prove is that they were here, I believe it was January 1st of 1982, that they had not committed any crimes of moral turpitude, that they weren't any drug addicts, and that they had no contagious diseases and what have you. And you got in, and you're right, it was a very cumbersome process. And it is no different today. It's
and
just
it cost a lot of money because there were a lot of legal fees through each step.
Well, as a lawyer, I'm not going to complain about the legal fees, but I will suggest to you there were government fees.
There were, no, that's what I'm talking about. There were a lot of government fees.
There were government fees. Folks had to pay the government to immigrate, but I think everyone gladly paid that in order to receive permanent residence in the United States, being able to come out of the shadows and really establish a life here in the United States.
Let's talk about some of the economic benefits that came out of legalizing 3 million undocumented immigrants. All of a sudden you had people that were paying taxes lawfully, paying into Social Security, and came out of the shadows.
Imagine that. You know, just the tax revenue alone is unimaginable. And what all these folks contributed and still contribute, you know, to the economy, I don't think that's even measurable.
Well, again, looking at the family members that came up through that process, I have one family member that came through it who is a well-established paint contractor, and he hires employees, he does a lot of contracts, he pays into the government, and he came up through that process.
And congratulations to him and more power to him and all the others who made it through that process and became successful. But I don't think, Edmundo, that this is the quarrel that the current administration or other administrations have today with immigration. It's not that was an amnesty at that time. I think the problem is that, on the other hand, the trade-off, if you remember that I spoke about the enforcement, that no more unauthorized workers come in, was never enforced, and I think that's where the quarrel comes in.
Where are we with enforcement today? I mean, you know, I know that in the last year there has been a crackdown. Just this past month there was a crackdown in North Texas where they went into a factory and hundreds of undocumented immigrants got captured and got prosecuted.
Yes, there are two ways to look at enforcement. One is going after unauthorized workers, and the other one is going after the employers who employ them, and both is happening currently. The administration has ramped up enforcement on the employment side by 400%. Now that's a lot, and the rates you're talking about, all the preference memoranda, if you so will, were done away with. In the past, ICE and CBP or any law enforcement agency, they had a preference list or a priority list on how to enforce the immigration laws. Any law enforcement agency, of course, has never enough money to enforce everything, so there was a priority list. Let's go after hardened criminals first. Let's go after aggravated felons first, and then go down the list. Now that's all gone. You're in the country unauthorized, it doesn't matter who you are. The ICE is going to go after you.
Let's talk about 2001. How did 2001 have an impact on immigration today?
2001 had a very big impact. Of course, the aftermath of 9/11, we still feel that today. And what it did with respect to immigration is it called for the USA Patriot Act. Of course, the best described that all the data sharing started among agencies. The Social Security Administration sharing data with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI sharing data, the Department of State sharing data. So that was probably the biggest thing. But what happened then is that the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, got broken up in 2003. And we got the Department of Homeland Security, which we still have today, for this very purpose. And under the Department of Homeland Security, we have three agencies that you and I deal with today, and that's the USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is tasked with providing immigration services. So that's the agency that actually dishes out the benefits. So if someone gets a green card, that's where that comes from. So if someone gets a work authorization, that is the service agency where you get that. Then we have CPP, which is Customs and Border Protection, and those, of course, are the men and women who protect our borders. And then we have ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and that's the agency that enforces the immigration laws inside the country. So out of one agency, the INS, now we have three: USCIS, CPP, and ICE.
ICE is not viewed in a very positive light among immigrant rights groups. There's been calls to abolish it. Is that realistic?
Absolutely not. That'll be the same if you say, let's abolish the police. I can see the sentiment behind that. And
it is sentiment.
Of course it is. But there is a legitimate purpose that ICE has, of course. I mean, they are to enforce the immigration laws inside the United States. And they have another purpose. They go after money launderers, they go after child pornography inside the country. So there's many other law enforcement duties that ICE has. They also enforce employment verification eligibility with employers. That's the program that I spoke about that's ratcheted up by 400%. So they certainly have a legitimate purpose. I just wish that the means and manner on how it is conducted were maybe in a more humane manner.
Let me complicate the issue of immigration even further. In the last year, we saw Congress come together to start the debate of immigration. And during this time, we saw a president who would send out a tweet saying he disapproved of what was being discussed in Congress, and all of a sudden you just saw Congress just drop what they were discussing. How much of an impact does the president have on immigration law?
Well, the president, of course, has an impact on immigration law because he is the executive and he's the manager of the executive branch, which really enforces the laws. The president, like with any new law, has his or her wish list. That we know. But the Congress should not be impressed by what the president wants, especially when it comes to immigration law, because it is the Congress's duty to legislate on immigration. And if you go back, Edmundo, you may recall that in 2007, the younger President Bush, wanted a comprehensive immigration reform, and there was a good team and a bipartisan team. The Gang of Eight, I think, was in 2012.
Oh, it was 2012.
I think in
That's right,
2007, I think it was now the both late senators, John McCain and Edward Kennedy,
That's right.
from different sides of the aisle, who wrote a quite nice, a comprehensive immigration reform bill, which passed through the Senate, but then again got stuck in the House. And then again in 2012, the same thing happened. That's where the Gang of Eight came out. We had 4 Republican senators and we had 4 Democratic senators, and they were quite successful in legislating. But then again, it got stuck in the House. So I would suggest to you, it's not just this president maybe throwing wrenches into the system by way of tweeting. I still believe it is the Congress's duty. That's what our Constitution says. And shame on the Congress on not getting it done or refusing to get it done.
Do you feel, and we're taping this before the upcoming November election, so this is going to air after the November election, but let me ask you this. Do you feel that if Congress were to turn blue, do you feel like there's more of a chance that immigration reform will pass with the cooperation of the president? Because the president says he's willing to negotiate. He's been very vocal about that. Do you feel like immigration reform would have a chance if Congress goes to the Democrats?
Well, as I said in the beginning of our interview, I'm going to stay optimistic. But I don't think that immigration can become a Republican or a Democratic issue. If you go back to the Obama administration, if I recall correctly, Mr. Obama had an all-Democratic government at one point, the House and the Senate. And that was his biggest thing, to pass immigration, and nothing happened then. So no, I am not very confident of whether this is a blue or red Congress to pass immigration laws. I think there are good ideas on both sides. There's good ideas on the Republican side, there's good ideas on the Democratic side. I think it is up to the Congress to get together and reach across the aisle and come to a compromise there.
Let's talk about an issue that the president brings up pretty frequently, and that is the issue of merit-based immigration. In your opinion, or do you feel there are benefits to a merit-based system, and what are some of the downfalls to it?
Well, I think there is merit-based systems in Canada, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and maybe in other countries around the world somewhere, and they are not very successful. They have been at some point where these countries attracted highly educated persons or persons who had a trade or skill that was needed in that country. But if you just fill out a form and you're rated by points, you might end up in that country and then you're not going to find a job because there's 50,000 others with that same qualification already there. And that's what happened in Canada, and that's what might happen in the United States if you go to a merit-based system. Now that's what I see as the downside of it. The benefit of a merit-based system is, of course, that you can attract or you can weed out or sift out persons that are really needed in the United States, or persons whom we want here. But I don't think that you can change our current immigration system to a solely merit-based system. Our system is based on family immigration. It's going to stay based on family immigration, and I'm not going to make the word chain immigration a curse word, because that's just the way it is. The first member comes here, and then at some point in time you petition for your family. I think that in part we have a merit-based immigration system. If an employer wants to bring an engineer here, then they have to prove that this person is an engineer. You want to bring a scientist, you got to prove that they're a scientist. If you want to bring an artist or someone else, you got to prove all of that. So and we bring approximately 140,000 employment-based immigrants to the United States each year, they're all merit-based. They don't just come here because they want to work. No, they're all merit-based.
Let's talk about current immigration to the United States. Where is legal immigration coming from?
It is mostly family immigration. Right now, we bring about 1.1 million persons a year, of which about 800,000 are from family-based petitions. About 140,000 are employment-based, and then there's about 85,000 refugees, give or take. So that adds up to about a million.
What about undocumented immigration? Where's that coming from?
From all over the world. As you well know, in the past, most undocumented persons came across the southern border, but as transportation worldwide improved, of course, people come here by all sorts of means and started overstaying their visas. So now undocumented persons are from all over the world, even though the majority may be from our southern hemisphere. There were maybe 2 to 3 million in 1986, because we know that because about 3 million got their green cards at the time. And right now, according to the Pew Research Center, there's approximately 11.2 to 12 million undocumented persons.
That's from 2015.
That's from 2015, but nevertheless, about 3% of our population, yes.
What is their story? Where do they go from here? What can they do? They can't vote. They don't have a voice in the system. But what can these 11 million undocumented immigrants do to get their voice heard?
Well, I think, of course, there are always criminal aliens, just like there's criminals, everywhere in any country from every walk of life. And it seems to me that in the media, we always hear about the criminal aliens. Maybe we ought to start advertising what other undocumented workers have done. Some have become lawyers, some have become doctors, some have, raised families here and have their own businesses, have contributed to society. Maybe more needs to be talked about that. But unfortunately, these people are trapped within our immigration laws. They're here undocumented, and if they were to leave, they're excluded from coming back for 10 years. So what choice do you have? Stay here undocumented or be barred for 10 years to come back? It makes no sense, does it?
Where is the current immigration coming from? Has it leveled off with all the rhetoric that exists in the United States today that is so anti-undocumented immigrant? And over the summer, we saw a deluge of Central Americans coming into the United States. We saw family separation, and we saw that going around the world. Are people being discouraged from coming into the United States illegally?
People are being discouraged, and the administration has gone through great length to do that, not just in the United States, but also overseas. There are advertising campaigns in Central and South America not to come to the United States. People are being told what to expect at the border and what might happen, if they come into the country. That is nothing new, of course. Europeans have been doing that since the European Union was established for many, many years. But yes, immigration is being discouraged, but I think it's just a function of the marketplace. If we're at full employment, you'll see people coming again.
Where do you see movement as far as growth of undocumented immigrant coming from? Is it still primarily Texas and California and the Southwest?
This is where we hear it mostly in the media, but it is really hard to say. I mean, there's so many factories and places in the Midwest where there are many, many undocumented workers. I think undocumented workers are all over the country, but the most are still in California, Texas, Florida, Arizona.
Okay, let's go back to the optimism. 2019, where do you see this going?
Well, we will have a new Congress. So again, I'll stay optimistic, and hopefully, we can get immigration reform. I believe that comprehensive immigration reform is probably too big for the Congress. I think they will have to piecemeal it, do it one legislative piece at a time. I think that is...
let's talk about piecemeal. You and I had this conversation a year ago where we said a piecemeal approach might be something that could be more realistic. Why isn't Congress not looking at a piecemeal approach? Why is that taboo?
I'm of course not a politician, but I suspect, with having midterm elections this year and any member of Congress being in election mode for a lifetime, really, all the time, nobody wants to touch that hot button issue. But hopefully after these elections and with a new Congress, we'll have a chance. When we spoke last time, we were far away from those elections, but nevertheless, the administration was really, cracking down on having anything done, really burying any idea that came out of the Congress.
Let's talk about the kind of cases you deal with. How frustrating is it for you to deal with these cases day in and day out, expecting for there to be changes on the congressional side so that you can have literally better news to give your clients?
Well, Edmundo, we can't afford to be frustrated because that'll divert our attention away from those cases. So we stay on top of things. We pride ourselves on practicing at the cutting edge, and we'll do whatever it takes. And if we have to bring a case to federal court, then that's what we will do. If we can find any way to fight for a person, then we will do it. However, in some cases, it's just not possible.
So again, what you're looking at right now is for DACA to go to the Supreme Court?
That's what I'm suspecting, yes.
Okay. Christian Zeller, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Christian Zeller has been our guest. He is a managing partner at Maney, Zeller, PA. He limits his practice to immigration and nationality law. He has been our guest on today's Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Have a safe and pleasant week.